Welcome back to another episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be talking about three different stories. One about why marijuana legalization on the federal level doesn't seem to actually matter. The author makes a pretty interesting argument. Why Kamala Harris should not actually focus on the economy as she goes in for this 2024 election season. And then a really interesting one talking about the possibility of civil war and how it may be closer than you think. But also, I like to take a step back from that one and reevaluate some of the points it makes. And of course, we are going to end today with our Daily Delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive and ready to take on the day. Now, that's enough rambling for me. Let's jump in to our daily debate. So, should marijuana be legal? We've had this question before. I want to hear your opinions again. We also have new people since I asked that question, since it was at the very beginning of this channel. Are there legitimate uses for it? Do you think that everybody should have access to it? Should there be a license, restrictions, so on and so forth? Let me know all the opinions. Throw it down there in the comments section down below. So, the first article comes from Counterpunch. Headline reads, "Marijuana. Your permission isn't really necessary." And when it talks about your permission, it is speaking about the federal government / the state governments. And they're saying, well, at the end of the day, do we really need it to be legal versus decriminalized? Do we really have to go through all these hoops and get it past all the senators and House members who may not like it, the older population that may not like it? Because if we're being frank, Gen Z, Gen Millennial, whatever, Gen M, Millennial generation, even some Gen Xers are pretty pro marijuana. They're pretty friendly to it. And even if you're in my camp where you're like, I'm fine, I can live without it, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily sitting there saying, but nobody else can have it. A lot of people in our generation are sitting back and saying, yeah, I don't really care one way or another as long as you're not necessarily harming me. Then again, opinions may change as people get older. Maybe they see negative effects in their friends. Maybe they see negative effects in their community. Maybe they're afraid that their children might actually start using these sort of drugs, especially now that they're extremely potent. And I just want to really put the idea out there that if marijuana versus the 1980s versus now is 10 times, maybe even 15 times as potent, imagine when we have kids, when Gen Z has kids in another 20, 25 years, and maybe even when by the time they're actually participating in this in a really ideal world, if they're going to participate, hopefully it's later on. So give that another, maybe you have kids in 10 years and then 20 years after that, more or less, maybe like 18. So 30 years from now, imagine how much more potent it could be. And there have been plenty of new studies coming out, especially with the elevated levels of THC and CBD. There have been new studies talking about the possibility of people actually having different psychotic incidences with it because it is such a more potent form of the drug, or at least the THC and the CBD within the marijuana is so much stronger that it has more drastic effects and has been known to cause some sort of psychiatric issues in a certain subsect of the population. Now imagine if that continues to gain in potency and it affects more people. Also, there's also the fact that I've always looked at the research and said, is marijuana actually addictive? And some research has come back and forth on that nowadays. Some people that are trying to debunk the value of marijuana and really push back against this movement have been saying, yes, it actually is addictive. But even then, I would always phrase it as maybe the substance itself, THC, CBD, these substances aren't necessarily addictive, but people get addicted to the feeling. Then again, I have also known plenty of people in my life who are able to operate by using it casually, and there's no biggie. They literally go about their normal day. Maybe they relax 1 or 2 days of the week by using some sort of marijuana product, and they have no change in their, how should I say? Maybe you could argue that they have a change in their productivity after they consume some of these things, but overall they're still able to operate as a normal member of society and relax and have a good time when they're home, and it doesn't necessarily affect everything in a negative way. So these are obviously all the things that are swirling around it, and I really thought it was important to bring up that fact that if we've seen such an increase in potency over the last 40 years, why can't we see the same thing going forward the next 30 years? And we have to evaluate whether or not it'll be a problem at that point. Because In small doses, plenty of drugs are completely fine. I mean, we use some opioids for painkillers, and yet in larger quantities, even though opioids on almost any quantity are addictive, on larger quantities they can be much worse for you. Or as we've created more potent drugs, we have to limit the amount that we give to people. So maybe the tablet sizes get smaller. Maybe the I don't want to say injection, but maybe the amount of liquid an IV infused with some of these drugs, we actually give them less of it, or we have it on a slow drip, such as morphine when you're in the hospital. So these are serious questions, and as things are picking up in the weed industry, we can't avoid this because at the end of the day, people are always going to want a better product. And also, if you smoke a lot, your tolerance goes up. Therefore, you need more potent marijuana in order to break through and actually be able to feel the effects of it. Well, that's fine for people who have been smoking for a long time, but that novice who just comes in and says, yeah, I want that granddaddy Kush, purple, blue, whatever. Sorry, don't know the lingo. And whoever says that and just ignorantly buys the most potent type of marijuana, you're going to seriously sit back and say, are you sure you're okay with that, man? Are you experienced? And maybe they're not ready to handle all that extra juice, all that extra concentration that is going on there. And also with concentrates and, waxes and things like that, you have a hyper concentrated form of the thing that is within the marijuana that you really need to be careful about because it is extremely potent. So all these are serious considerations going into the future. But what is the author arguing about right now? Quote, and this is kind of picking up in the middle, but we'll let him cook. Quote, I signed a petition to put Amendment 3 on the ballot. In fact, I've been signing similar petitions on the subject for years, and I intend to vote for it in November. He's talking about the ballot initiative Amendment 3 in the state of Florida. Quote, I expect it to pass. I hope it passes. I'm thankful to Trump for kinda sorta endorsing it, but that kinda sorta endorsement really highlights two aspects of the issue for me. And what does it actually include? Well, Amendment 3 is for marijuana to be legalized for adults. So what is this contrast that this gentleman is feeling? Quote, the first aspect is Trump's call for it to be done correctly, by which he means prohibit the use of it in public spaces so we do not smell marijuana everywhere we go. That's one perspective. Quote, I suppose it's possible that there's something special about Palm Beach. I've never been there, but I live near Gainesville, Florida, and when I'm in town, I already smell marijuana everywhere I go. And those are his two sides to it, which is, if you're trying to make the argument that it being legal is going to change the atmosphere, literally, because of what you're smelling, but figuratively, and there's going to be more open pot use, it's going to bring about the smell of marijuana, which some people do not like, everywhere, then you don't really change anything by supporting or not supporting this amendment because it already smells like that. And I think when you decriminalize some of these products, you're obviously going to see more, and I say think, it's obvious. If you decriminalize some of these products, you're going to see more rampant use of it. If you live anywhere close to Northern Virginia, you smell it in a lot of different places. I'll be honest, when I lived in Kentucky, I smelt it very, very rarely. And it's not even that it's fully legal. I mean, it's just I've smelt it very rarely when I was in Kentucky. Then again, not as concentrated, not as many people living in one area. Also, I didn't necessarily live in a jam-packed neighborhood. I lived in kind of a little spread out place in downtown in the capital in Frankfurt. So I smelt it every once in a while when I was walking through there. I very seldom smelt it when I was going through a Lexington or a Louisville. Sometimes I would smell it in like Bowling Green and other places like that. But the point that the author's getting at is saying it's not going to change that much. And the point that I'm trying to get at is I don't necessarily know if it's as widespread as some people think. But then I moved back to Virginia and I was like, oh, nope, never mind. I take it back. It is definitely something that you cannot avoid. You walk through Arlington, you walk through Alexandria, you walk in DC, and you are going to smell it. There's no way around it. And the author's point that it's already this way is actually very well taken. Yes, legalizing it ain't gonna change anything because if people are already allowed to go out there and do it, or they just don't care, or the cops don't want to put in the time or the effort to arrest these people for minor offenses like that, now that it is no longer as restricted, or your use of it is as restricted as it used to be under the law, then of course people are going to get away with it, and it's not necessarily going to change that much. But does that mean that the people who are opposed to it and want to keep the use of it out of public are wrong? Just because the author pins down something very, very particular, which is, oh, you'll be able to smell it. It'll be used, he says that it'll be used in public, which was Trump's overall point, which maybe we shouldn't let it be used in public. It would be used in private, just like it was back in New York City or New York back in the day. So is that actually directly connected to, if you're allowed to use it in public versus in private, is that directly connected to the amount of marijuana smell that you're going to smell? I think yes. Even though the author is dismissing it and saying, well, it already smells like weed. Yeah, but imagine it smells like more weed. Imagine that people are able to actually go out there and smoke wide open in the middle of the street, and you can smell it absolutely everywhere, versus it creeping out of some windows, versus being something that is restricted to your own home, your own private property. Totally cool with that. Honestly, in public, I don't necessarily care too much. Then again, the smell, I smell it, I'm like, look at that, the beautiful smell of America in 2024. And I kind of wince at it. I'm like, oh, okay, I guess we're going through some of this. But I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to not smelling it either. But my point being, I think the author's argument isn't necessarily falling apart, because there are more aspects to this than just that. But for someone like Donald Trump, who is not necessarily the most refined thinker on everything, when you just make the point, oh, well, I don't want to smell it everywhere, you should use it in private, and then you really refine what he's saying down to, oh, he doesn't want him to use it in public because he doesn't want it to smell, I feel like you're still missing a lot of the context there, and you're oversimplifying the argument against marijuana, because he goes on to be pretty sassy about it, no offense. Quote, whether you use the stuff or not, legalizing it makes your life better in many ways. For example, you don't have to pay for as many cops or as many prison cells. Don't like the smell? Too bad. Get used to it. I think that while his conclusion is not necessarily wrong, we are going to have to get used to it. It is the trend. This is our generation. Either they like it, they don't mind it, or they're not rabidly opposed to it, so they're not going to stand up and fight for it. So yes, people are going to definitely get used to it. But I don't necessarily know if, one, just because it already smells like it, that doesn't mean that using it in public won't make it smell like it more, won't make it worse. But also the fact that you say, well, it'll make your life better in many ways. For example, you won't have to pay for as many cops or as many prison cells. I'm gonna take a wild guess here and say that the amount of arrests for drugs specifically has been relatively even across the states that have decriminalized versus not decriminalized marijuana. And what I mean by that is not weed specifically, but overall, the arrests are going to be pretty similar, or at least if you look at the two places and you hold them against not each other, but you hold them against their pre-legalized or decriminalized statistics, it's not going to be that change, because guess what? At the end of the day, they have certain metrics that they need to hit to prove that they're effective, so on and so forth. So they're just going to move it to another location. So you're still probably going to have to pay for the police department. And also, they can also move those resources in other places to maybe go after traffic violators a little bit more. I don't necessarily know everything that they're going to do with that extra money, but I don't really think that they're just saying, oh, yeah, we can just shrink the budget when we decriminalize marijuana. I don't think it's quite that simple. And I'm not just trying to do it's not that quite that simple kind of argument. I'm being generous and saying it is not that simple, period, full stop. And you would actually have to pull some of the resources away from the cop departments first for it to actually work out, before they would just shift into a new place where they could hit their metrics, make sure that they're protected. The unions would sit there and say, okay, we need to make sure that our employees don't get fired, that there's people that aren't getting off the force. We need to be able to have our collective bargaining power, because the more people we have in this department, not only the more people are we protecting, and therefore the larger dues we can get, but also the more influence we can have over what the say is, or as many people in prison cells. I think that's relatively accurate, especially on the federal level, with a whole bunch of drug offenders who, I don't want to say don't deserve to be there, but the question is definitely, if the marijuana laws are repealed, should they be taken out of those cells, and should they possibly be forgiven? Should they get a pardon? Maybe so, maybe not. But the author definitely brings up some interesting points of view there, and I just want to say I'm not 100% with him, but I do understand where he's coming from, and I am in the camp of, well, hey, if it's going to be, it's going to be. But I think his argument for getting there is not necessarily as good. I don't think that marijuana use should just be, especially because I don't think you actually address any of the root causes. You don't make an argument based off why people actually need marijuana or want marijuana, maybe because that's a little bit harder to prove, and it may actually fall into some arguments of cultural degeneracy that you don't want to necessarily argue. But I think that would probably be the better approach rather than just saying, oh, yeah, well, you need to get over it, and this is wrong because of this, this, and this. They're pretty fallacious points. They're very superficial points. They're just right on the top. You're not actually getting to the root of the issue, and it's kind of snarky when you come off at the end and say, no, you know what? No, you just got to get used to it, even though I made no solid points addressing what some of the core issues about degeneracy of the culture, addiction to dopamine, and the possible future outcomes of more people using marijuana, which are some genuine concerns that people have in those arguments. While I don't always agree with the people making those arguments, they definitely have a solid one, and it is hard to take that on head on, especially when you believe that you're on the same same plane of values, even though sometimes people aren't and they can't admit it. But hey, that's besides the point. Interesting article, no doubt. We will see how all of it pans out going into the future. Maybe this guy's right. Maybe you just got to get used to it because people just want to do it, and it's not going to make that much of a difference. Or maybe it'll make a huge difference, and there's a little bit of a public pushback. We'll see. All right, so let's jump to our second article that comes from Salon. It's not the economy, stupid. Why Kamala Harris should focus on everything else. Also, I realize all three of the articles today have titles of first claim and then backup sentence with a colon in the middle, which is hilarious to me that they all have the same structure, but that's just me being an absolute nerd. So let's actually get into this article. Why isn't it the economy? The Bill Clinton era taught politicians many things, and one of them was, it's the economy, stupid. Carville even gets out there today and says, well, maybe it's still a little bit of economy, but at the end of the day, that is something where people are pinching pennies. They don't want to necessarily live in poverty, and they feel like a president can have a material effect on that. They can have a government that doesn't necessarily spend too much of their money or is rapidly inflating their currency. That's just continuing to take on more debt, and therefore devaluing the U.S. dollar. All of those things, even though some people don't necessarily know them when you ask them to explain it in an economics class, they understand it on a practical level, which is, oh, wow, 2 years ago, I was able to afford a house in my neighborhood when I was looking because I was renting until I could save up, and now I can't. Oh, wow, I could have bought this entire cart of groceries for $300 last year, and now it's running me maybe $325, $350, and I haven't gotten a wage increase. All my other bills are more expensive. All these things people can feel, and when the government is as involved in the economy as it is, you're going to look to the government, and the government's going to have to take on the blame. So worrying about the economy always seemed like a pretty good electoral strategy. But no, Salon's saying actually not a big deal. So let's go into what they actually think here. We're going to jump in right to the middle. Quote, regardless of whatever statistics Harris or any other Democrat might throw out there, poll numbers imply that no amount of persuasion will convince voters that they feel better about the economy now than they did under Trump. Yet, when it comes to economic matters, all the momentum in the world apparently means nothing. Last month, the ABC post Ipsos poll showed Trump ahead by 10 points among voters who were asked which candidate they trusted more to handle the economy. After the historic surge of energy, fundraising, and viral memes that Harris's nomination has generated, the same gap is down to 9 points. So what they're saying here, and it's actually a pretty interesting argument, is they're not going to be able to make up that gap no matter how much they message on it. And I think Trump's team has done a good job actually trying to tie her directly to the Biden economy. I mean, they have the ads of Bidenomics. Then again, her freedom ads are pretty persuasive, especially for the middle ground voter, I would say, who really do want to not idealize, but they want to try to live up to those ideals of freedom. I guess that is idealizing it if I'm being harsh, but they want to ensure that we are protected against government encroachment. Now, whether you think one side or the other is going to do more of that, that doesn't necessarily matter, because the person messaging about freedom is probably going to get more of those center voters who do believe that. Have always been an anti-establishment, an anti-government kind of country. Then again, there have been times where we've loved the intervention of the government to fix some of our problems. I'm not trying to deny that. But overall, the ethos of our country is one of revolution and one of revolt against tyranny. So it is something that I believe personally. Then again, not always true, but like I said, on a personal level, I believe that it is within the fundamental ethos of the American soul. And that's not to say that if you don't necessarily hold that, you're not American. But if you're to look at one identifier of American culture, it would be that, in my opinion, and you could probably see most of that to some degree within our populace. We don't like being yelled at and told exactly what to do, and especially in a way that is negative and abusive and so on and so forth. Then again, not many people like that in general, but you can make arguments that other cultures are more okay with hierarchical structures that don't necessarily keep them down, but do hem them in for sure. But what they are trying to really go at here with their freedom message is that, hey, we're going to make sure the government is out of your life. We're appealing to them. They're appealing to them on issues such as abortion. They're appealing to them on housing and the freedom to prosper here in America and have good housing, whether it be to have a better supplemental income for raising a child, all of these sort of things, freedom from economic worry, freedom from the government telling me what you can do with your body, freedom from the local school board banning certain books that you think are important to your child's education. All of these things would fall into the freedom from category that the Harris-Walz campaign are very, very willing to lean into. And what Salon is saying is, if you can't make ground on the economy, then you have to focus on these different issues. And I think it is brilliant in that they have an alternative message that truly works, that they are able to actually capture something special within the American people. They're able to capture a mood and bring it to fruition in a campaign message. They're able to capture it, use it, and basically pump up their own sales by talking about it and then getting everybody else to come in and help them blow those sales with a giant fan. Now, does that mean it can overcome the 10% that, or at this point 9%, that say they prefer Trump to the economy? That's what I don't know. Because Salon is right. Harris does not necessarily have the economic issues on point, and she needs to have some messaging on it, but those other things are going to be more important since people aren't moving on the economy. And my question would be, yes, or my statement would be, yes, that's fair, focus on those other things, but maybe you should focus on eating into that economy too, because I don't know if being 9% down on the economy and having all these other freedom messages is really going to convince people at the bottom line, literally when they walk into the voting booth, they have not decided, and they hear Kamala Harris saying, you are going to have the freedom from blah, 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 we're not going to allow them to take this. Those all sound great. Versus Donald Trump saying, I'm going to make sure that the economy is thriving again and that you can find a good job, you can pay for your family essentials. I think nowadays, even though that ethos of freedom from the government intervening, and we've seen plenty of ballot referenda saying this exact same thing, any sort of encroachment, whether it's for or against certain issues from either side of the political aisle, it always comes out, government, get out of my life. While I think that message is extremely, extremely potent, I also know that we are a culture that understands money, that understands the value and practicality of it, and sometimes probably focuses a little bit too much on it. And I think when they're in that voting booth, if they have to choose between those two messages at the same, they're literally holding both of them in their head, and they have to choose. I think I know which one they're going for, and it is not the freedom from argument. Then again, I could very well be wrong, but I think Salon brings up a very, very good point. If you want to read that entire article, they have some very interesting ones. All the links are in the description below that like and subscribe button. But before you go down there and read that, let's jump to our final article that comes from Daily Signal. Terrifyingly plausible. Why you're wrong to think civil war can't happen here. And I'll be honest, I am not a person that says civil war can't happen here. I am a person that says, I think that it is unlikely. And that is not because it is here in America. That's because I think the divides are overplayed a little bit. Then again, all it takes are small factions of both sides being willing to battle it out in certain locations. And that's what the author would call a civil war, not necessarily state versus state, not necessarily exurban or suburban, but literally battles within cities. Imagine you have a whole bunch of chops all across the nation. You have the Independent Republic of Trumpistan. You have the Independent Republic of Bernie stand. You have the Independent Republic of Joe Manchin stand. And all these different locations, people have pushed back and revolted against the government. They're defending their own little land there. They come to blows with other people who have different values than them. And this could be, or even just fighting in the streets that aren't necessarily divided into little segments of the city that they've taken over, like the CHOP in Seattle, or I take that back. They haven't taken it over now. They took it over during the Summer of Love. But the point being that the author is trying to really explain to the reader that it is not as simple, and I know I've used that a lot. Oh, it's not as simple as this. But it is not as straightforward as one would think, especially in an era where we are used to a little bit of more urban warfare. We're used to the insurgency tactics, the guerrilla warfare, the using other people as human shields. These have become practices and tropes that American people are fully used to, or at least have been heard to be used in other places. And for all we know, it could very well happen in our own nation. Quote, one of our events was a crisis over the debt, which would issue forth in a new Tea Party movement, Howie tells the Daily Signal podcast. He calls it it's just completely random that we happen to use that phrase, which the Tea Party movement adopted in 2010. Then they also talk about a weapons of mass destruction attack on New York. They say that that's similar. So these are all pivot points. These are all events that could very well lead to the next civil war from the author and historian Neil Howie, or it could just be Neil Howe if the E is silent. Sorry, sir, for mispronouncing your name. So he said one is the new Tea Party movement because of the debt. The 9/11 attacks is reminiscent to a WMD attack on New York. COVID and being a pandemic that affects the entire world, but also the United States was one of them. And then the rise of Russia invading another post-Soviet Union nation was one. The last one, which I would agree is actually the most likely one, is a nullification crisis, where you see a state basically say, nope, we're not going to go along with your federal laws. And if anything, that could lead to another secession crisis. I don't see that one happening particularly unless it's Texas. I'll be honest, I don't think, some people have argued that California would leave. I have a hard time because of the network connections of the really rich people there, but also the Democratic Party there, that I highly doubt California would secede. I do think that it's more likely in Texas, but still it's a little bit it's a little bit more of a question, and I'm not necessarily confident that any of these examples would actually lead to a civil war. But what you do have to keep in mind here is this next quote. Quote, one misconception people have is that civil wars require geographically separate places, he notes. That is not true. And take a look at the Spanish Civil War. That was a brutal, horrible war, and there was very little geographical continuity about it. It was like honeycombed. The Civil War in China was the same way. And when he said the Civil War in China, because I haven't actually read up on the Spanish Civil War, but when I read up on the Civil War in China, I was definitely illuminated when you have both parties, both actors, both armies taking multiple cities, taking them back and forth. They weren't necessarily popping up in the exact same location. You're bombing cities that are thousands of miles inland in order to get to your target rather than just marching an army straight up in there. So it's definitely something that we cannot ignore, and to pretend as though the situation has not changed and evolved, and military tactics haven't changed and evolved, and that people aren't willing to do drastic things for what they believe, it would be naive of us to at least not take into consideration the fact that any of those things could happen. So I'm not trying to scare anybody, but I always want to make sure that we're honestly talking about some of the conversations that are happening within the nation. And I think this article is worth much more exploration. Like I said, link in the description. Go down there, find the article, give it a good read. If you haven't read Neil Howie before, I didn't read him before this. It gives more explanation of his worldview throughout. I think some of his books would actually be more interesting to take a deeper dive. But for us young people, this was not something, I mean, I wasn't born when he was doing most of his major writing. Most of his major writing probably happened towards the middle part of my dad's life. And I'm sure he grabbed one of the books when it was really famous. But for us younger people, we haven't necessarily heard these arguments, at least to the same degree. Maybe they're said in passing. Maybe you learn about them in political science. But take some more time, sit down with this article, maybe read some of his books, because it's a fascinating idea of the dissolving of a nation. And we definitely need to keep that in mind to make sure it doesn't actually happen to us. So let's jump to our last article that comes from Scoop Upworthy. Headline reads, "It's our daily delight. Cat's reaction upon receiving an adorable gift from dad has left everyone in awe." And I'll be honest, this cat got a little pillow underneath the face. Dad moved his hand, and then the cat went straight passed out on it. It's absolutely adorable. If you want to check out that video, like I said, also any of the articles from today, you can find all of them in the link in the description below, that like and subscribe button. Also down there, you can find the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Podvine, as well as the Twitter handle @YourDailyFlip, where I post a Twitter tirade every Tuesday and Thursday. And also check out 6 and 6, 6 stories from around the world in 6 minutes or less. That comes out the same day, but over here on the YouTube and on the RSS feed. So, with everything said, everything out of the way, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe, don't die.